Yeah, Minister, over Christmas the Apollo House occupation, which was a fantastic action to propel the indescribable housing and homelessness crisis to the top of the political agenda, and the huge support that it received, as Deputy Coppinger has already said, simply enormous across-the-board support, was a fantastic intervention in this deplorable crisis to further pile on pressure on this government, on yourself, to address this absolutely chronic situation, a crisis where, again, as Deputy Coppinger said, where literally words and descriptions fail you at this point, because we've talked about it so much, we've protested so much, and that sort of people power action to propel this issue to the top of the political agenda is really, I think, the only way we are going to get the sort of change we need to force you to bring in the radical shift in policy that is necessary to deal with this crisis. The figures have already been quoted. Nearly 7,000 people now homeless, a figure that has increased exponentially, and the disgraceful fact that 2,549 of them are children. The numbers exiting homelessness and going into social housing has decreased solidly for the last 4 quarters. So whereas at the end of 2015, 241 people were exiting homelessness to go into social housing, by the end of Q3 of 2016, that number had reduced to 141. So you're failing, and of course that failure results from the central problem in your housing policy and strategy, which is the failure to build local authority housing with affordable rents, with the sort of tenant security that tenants really need, people on low and middle incomes who need secure rental tenancies. And that failure on your part, and successive governments, frankly, is exacerbated by your failure, or this exponential rise in homelessness results from your failure to give tenants in the private rental sector the sort of security and protection that they need. And this bill, therefore, is an attempt to do what you are failing to do, in ensuring that the tenants have real security, not the 4 years in the Part 4, which you only get after 6 months, but to ensure that after 2 months tenants have indefinite security. But what we need is indefinite security, real rights for tenants, so they do not have to worry every few years about whether they will have a roof over their head, to extend the notice period for rent increases to 180 days from 90 days, to extend the notice periods for eviction after 5 years, to give people at least a full year notice for any possible eviction, to categorise banks and receivers as landlords so that they have the proper obligations of landlords, and then critically, as Deputy Coppinger has already said, to ensure that if people use the excuse of a family member moving in, that they will have to pay compensation to the tenant if they do that, and to completely end the practice of justifying or allowing evictions on the basis that a property is being sold, as so many landlords are using these excuses now simply for the purposes of exploiting the spiralling rent crisis and evicting people out of greed. Nothing more than greed to make money. And when we say that these sort of measures should be taken, you resist them by saying that this is somehow going to disincentivise people from landlords and investors going into the rental sector, suggesting somehow that it will lead these landlords or property investors to flee. But the truth, of course, is that the opposite has happened. We have had a dramatic growth of the private rental sector, and we now have 328,000 people living in private rented accommodation, an increase of 61%. Since 2011. So far from landlords fleeing the sector, investors, people with money, are flooding into it because they are making an absolute killing from spiralling rents and from the misery being suffered by those who are being made homeless or who are being charged absolutely extortionate rents. And frankly, the brutality of some of these people, particularly these vulture funds, is really quite shocking. Something I may have to give you more details of later in the week. I won't go into too much detail now, Minister, but your rent certainty proposals from before Christmas that allowed for the 4% rent increases, some moved very quickly to get in before the curtain came down, limiting rent increases to 4%. And I'm dealing with one whole apartment block where I'm pretty sure it's a vulture fund. It's definitely in the hands of receivers who, on the day before the legislation was enacted, sent out letters to every single one of the tenants saying they were jacking up their rent by between 50 and 60%. Knowing, and they clearly understood the law perfectly, they were quoting all the new legislation and stuff, but the absolute sickening cynicism and greed of that knowing that there was going to be an attempt to limit rent increases, jacked them up literally 2 days before Christmas and the day before the legislation is commenced. And I suspect we're going to see an awful lot of that around the country. Something you were warned about, Minister, in the debate, in the lengthy debate we had about the inadequacies of your rent certainty measures. And that shows the level of cynicism, if you like, and greed and frankly cruelty by many of these vulture funds and landlords exploiting the housing and homelessness crisis. So it's against that kind of background we need serious rights for tenants, serious controls on these landlords. And as Deputy Coppinger rightly said, the idea that the family home issue or constitutional rights or apparent legal rights on private property should be somehow used as an excuse, if you like, in these situations is utter nonsense, because this is a business these people are in, and treating it according to the same sort of rights to private property in a situation where people are in a business is ridiculous. And I note that the legal problems with the constitutional right to private property disappear when it suits the political establishment in things like compulsory, compulsory purchase orders for roads and so on can be done, and even indeed in your own rent certainty proposals that were brought in. All the constitutional problems suddenly disappeared. And I suspect, in fact, it's highly dubious whether any of those constitutional restraints actually could not be challenged on the basis of the constitutional imperatives which allow us to reconcile those rights with the exercises of the common good.
Minister, perhaps you want to remove your amendment?
Thank you, Concord.